So we will, continue with the discussion of IO systems. So we talked about in the last class about the various modes of data transfer from IO devices to memory. So we talked about the first one, that is program driven, mode of transfer, and then we talked about interrupt driven mode of data transfer, and the last and the most important one is the direct memory access. Okay. In this, there is no intervention of CPU. CPU relinquishes its control over the system bus. Okay. So what happens is the bus that connects the IO with the CPU and memory, CPU and memory are connected. It relinquishes the bus, and DMA control. There is another section called DMA control, which provides this facilitation. The DMA controller, executes the entire DMA transfer operation. So what happens in DMA mode of transfer is, in DMA that a circuit called DMA controller, it arranges the transfer of data from IO devices to the system memory directly without the need of interference for CPU. Okay, the DMA controller sends a signal called DMA request to CPU. After CPU gets the DMA request, it grants the system bus to the DMA. Okay, system bus to the DMA, that you take charge of the system bus, I am leaving the system bus. So what will happen next is, the CPU will send with a positive acknowledgement of bus grant. Bus grant means it is granting the bus to the DMA for data transfer directly between IO and memory. Okay. After the DMA receives the bus grant, it will then acknowledge the necessary IO device, the device from which, or the IO memory, secondary memory from which the data is to be transferred. The DMA controller will notify that DMA grant has been happened. Okay. So DMA controller requests CPU with bus DMA request, These are the series of actions that takes place. Then CPU replies with bus grant, okay, to DMA controller. Then in third step, DMA controller will send to the respective IO device about DMA grant. That means the device will get to know that yes, I have been given direct access to the system memory to transfer data. Then in fourth step, data transfer will take place. Data transfer takes place. So in direct memory access, what happens is, there is no intervention of CPU. Okay. Now it depends. There may be intervention of CPU, but usually this is a way out that we may keep the CPU aside and do the thing between IO and the system memory is done directly. Whatever transfer is to be done, that is done directly without the intervention of CPU. Okay. Now DMA may work in several other ways. There are 3 ways DMA operates. There are various modes. One is burst mode, and the second one is interleaved mode, and the third one is cycle stealing mode. Okay, so there are three modes in which the DMA work. But first of all, what happens? The idea behind it is, what is the idea behind DMA is, why it is called direct memory access is, there is a DMA controller which manages the data transfer between IO and memory. Okay, so what it does is, it takes the control of the bus from the CPU. For that matter, it sends a request called DMA request to CPU. On reception of DMA request from CPU will grant the bus to the DMA controller. They say yes, I acknowledge it, you may take the bus now. After that, the DMA will notify the IO devices that yes, DMA grant has been done. So it will send a message or a signal called DMA grant, after which data transfer will take place. Okay, so this is clear to you, I hope, that how DMA transfers take place, what is the standard procedure which is common to every node. After that, how the data transfer takes place. By the nature of it, we may classify the transfer of data in three modes in DMA or direct memory access. Okay, so there are three modes through which data will be transferred. The first one is burst mode. The second one is interleaved mode. And the third one is cycle stealing mode. So in DMA data transfer, it can be further categorized as three mode. One is burst mode, second one is interleaved mode, and the third one is cycle stealing mode. Now what happens in each mode we will see. In burst mode, what happens is, once everything, the steps has been done, what happens is, there is no intervention of CPU. From IO device to memory, directly data transfer takes place. Okay, for this is suitable when large data to be sent. Suppose 500 KB is to be sent, then each byte will be continuously sent one after another in burst mode until 500 KB is entirely transferred from IO to memory. CPU will not get the bus back. Okay, so within the transfer time, CPU has no power here. CPU has no interference. There is no interference of CPU. In burst mode, bulk data, large data is transferred from IO to memory, and in the time of transferring, there is no interference of CPU. Suppose it takes nearly 100 microseconds to transfer 500 KB, then in this entire 500 microseconds, there is no interference of CPU. CPU will not be taking part or have any role to play. Directly we can transfer data from IO to memory in such a case, in burst mode. Okay. Now the next mode is interleaved mode. Now what is interleaved mode? As the name in English, interleaved means doing something, then again doing something after some time, and again doing something. If there are 2-3 entities together, then each entity will have a share of time to do its work. That means interleaving. Okay. Suppose there are 3 persons, then 3 persons will equally share the resource. Okay. So interleave fashion means CPU and DMA has equal power or equal share. Okay, so they will work in interleaved fashion. That means in such a case, if T1 is used by CPU, then T2 will be used by DMA. Similarly, if T3 is used by CPU, then used by DMA. So in this way, half of the time, alternatively, the bus will be shared between CPU and DMA. Okay, the bus will be shared between CPU and DMA alternatively. Okay, this is in case of interleaved mode. Okay, so in this case, both will have equal share or equal power. No one is, working above another. Okay, in burst mode, DMA has absolute power. DMA has power. CPU has no power. Okay, everything is done by the DMA, but here CPU and DMA have equal power. Okay, half the time CPU uses, half the time DMA uses. Again, then CPU uses, DMA uses. So both have equal share on getting the bus. Now the third thing is cycle stealing mode. Cycle stealing mode. What happens in cycle stealing mode is here the DMA steals cycles from CPU. That means CPU has more power. CPU has more power. That is, even the bus has been granted, but CPU will give the grant to the DMA only if it is free. If CPU is free, then only DMA can run and make the data transfer happen. Only if CPU is free. That's why we say DMA steals the cycle from CPU. If at all CPU has some cycles to spare, it has some time, it is idle, then DMA can take the bus and can do its data transfer. If CPU is busy, bus will not be available to DMA for transfer. Okay, so in cycle stealing mode, CPU has power. Okay, if CPU is free, then only DMA can take control of the bus and make the data transfer from IO to system memory. Okay, so I hope all the three modes in DMA are pretty much clear to you. If you have any doubt, you can post it in the comment section. So I will just go through what we studied in modes of data transfer. We studied three modes of data transfer. One is program driven, second one is interrupt driven, and the third one is DMA. In DMA, there is no intervention of CPU unlike the former two modes. Here, again there are three other modes in which DMA functions. One is bus mode, second one is interleave mode, and third one is cycle stealing mode. Okay, so this was about data transfer mode. The last topic of this chapter is now extending the idea of DMA further. How can we extend the idea of DMA further? See, to understand properly, what does DMA does? DMA simply separates CPU and says that if there is some IO work, let me do it. Just give me the bus and let me do it. You do not interfere. That's what DMA is all about. But if we again further, there is some problem with DMA also now, because there is dependency of CPU. In burst mode, it is fine. In burst mode, it is fine. DMA is taking entire charge. DMA has full power in burst mode. DMA has full power in burst mode. But in other modes there is dependency, right? Since still CPU has interference. Okay, in other modes there is still CPU has interference. So CPU work is important. We cannot ignore the CPU work. Suppose you want to send 1000 KB of data. You can work in burst mode. You can give the entire bus to the DMA, and DMA will transfer 100 KB. But CPU cannot be stopped. Okay, for that entire time. This will lead to inefficiency. So that's why we have other mode called cycle stealing mode and interleave mode. But if we extend the idea of DMA, that processor called input output processor. Input output processor. If you have a different processor for it, then we need not need the help of CPU. अभी CPU का जरूरत ही नहीं है प्रोसेसिंग के लिए. क्यों? क्योंकि हम अगर अपना IO ऑपरेशन के लिए दूसरा ही प्रोसेसर रख दें, if we have a different independent processor for IO operation, then we would not have any dependency on CPU, isn't it? CPU can do its own work, and IO processing can be done by IO processor. Okay, so we will talk about input output processor now. Input output processor. So what is an input output processor? This is a processor which is responsible for doing IO operation mostly, and apart from that it can act like a normal processor. It can carry out arithmetic, logic, logical operation. It can carry out language translation and executions of programs. It can behave as per the normal processor, but input output processor is tend, or you can say it is required to do the IO operation. It is meant for IO operation. It is supposed to do IO operation, and apart from it, it can also carry out other arithmetic, logical operation, language translation. Okay, it can do other things as well. So, what is the advantage if we have it? Suppose this is the CPU, this is memory. They are connected, and they are connected to a system bus. Now, system bus is again connected to what? IO. This is what pretty much roughly we say a computer is. Now, if we have a system bus, then it will be much more, if we have processor, IOP, input output processor, then life will be much easier. This is what? These are IO devices. IO devices like keyboard, mouse, monitor. This is IO bus. We will say it is IO bus. Suppose this is our IO bus. Then this processor will take care of every IO processing. Okay, we do not need CPU now. CPU is not required for IO operation. For IO operations, CPU is not at all required now. We do not need CPU because whatever CPU was doing can be done by input-output processor. Input-output processor will take care of every operation that was done by CPU. So, through input-output processor, we can do the data transfers easily into the memory without needing CPU. CPU can parallelly run. So, it enhances parallelism. So, what is the advantages? It can enhance parallelism. Simultaneously, CPU can work and input-output operation can also be performed. Okay. So, this was about input-output processor, and we almost completed the input-output systems. Okay. So, I think you understood things, and if you have any doubt, you can post it in the comment section. I will reply to it, or otherwise you can directly contact me, and or we can discuss it further in the Zoom classes as well. Thank you.